Hi. I'll just stand here, I guess. So my name is Carleigh Kude. I'm a disability advisor at Stanford University. So what that means is that I'm the person responsible for facilitating accommodations for students with disabilities. Um, it's really dependent on the student and what the student needs. So I thought I would start today by just giving you a little bit of background information about myself, and then kind of giving you an overview of how disability services works in higher ed, and then we can sort of talk about transition planning. So I have been working in higher ed for almost 10 years, but I've been working in the disability services community for about 15 years here in the Bay Area. I started out in the nonprofit sector doing direct services and rehabilitation services, and moved into higher ed, and access and inclusion are sort of my biggest passion projects. So the way that I work is, as I sort of said, is mostly in response to students. I really believe in the model that students are their own experts in their disabilities and the way that the disability impacts them and what functional limitations they experience as a result of their disabilities. As I'm sure you all know, your students, your young children, or are becoming young adults, and everyone is really individual, and the needs are going to be really individualized. So there's not a one-size-fits-all model for accommodating students. So what is good for you to know is that preparing for college should start in high school, really. Just like all high school students are concerned about transitioning to college, so are students with DMD. So what does that mean? You have an additional layer of considerations to make about where to go to college, what schools to look at, how to prepare to get accepted to those colleges. Here in California, we have pretty high admissions competition. So what are the schools that your students want to go to? And how will you know if your student will have an accessible experience? Those are really good questions. And there's not a one-size-fits-all model, unfortunately. You do have to start with, okay, what is my student interested in? What am I interested in? What do I want to study? What do I want to do in college? Do I want to go and live on campus and have a great social life and party? Or do I really want to get into computer science and biology and get really serious about academics right away? Or do I want to do a little bit of both? And maybe you'll change your mind along the way, and that's okay too. So one of the biggest differences to understand about high school accommodations and college accommodations is that the laws really change. As a high school student, you are served under the IDEA laws, which say that high schools or K-12 have to accommodate you in the least restrictive environment so that you can successfully complete secondary education. Once you leave secondary education, if you can get admitted to college, then post-secondary educational institutions must accommodate you, but you must be what's considered otherwise qualified. So if you've ever had accommodations in high school where maybe you got waived out of academic requirements or didn't have to do as much homework as your peers, that sort of thing is not considered a reasonable accommodation in college. But you can ask. You always have the right to request accommodations. So there's so many different parts of figuring out what accommodations you're going to need in college, starting with housing, starting with how am I going to manage my time and pick my classes, to actually taking your tests and writing surfaces in the classroom. So working with the disability services professionals in the colleges that you're interested in from the pre-admissions point is really important. Another interesting part of my work is that it's completely dependent on what's called an interactive process. And actually in the laws that protect you and your students with disabilities, college's main obligation is to engage in an interactive process with students with disabilities. So I'd like this to be an interactive process because I'm an expert in accommodations in the post-secondary environment, but I'm not an expert in living with DMD. So I would like to please encourage you to ask me questions anytime, interrupt me. And I don't know any of you families, so I'm not sure how old the students are, where you live. Are most of you from the Bay Area? Okay, good. So this is a really rich environment for disability inclusion and access too. There are independent living centers in California that are very active in community living issues. Have you ever had to hire personal care attendants from outside of the family, or has personal care happened mostly within the family? These are questions that you're going to have to think about as you think about transitioning to college. There is also the California Department of Rehabilitation, which has transition planning services for youth with disabilities. They provide funding and support services and technology, and can also do mobility equipment evaluations, but it is a state department, so you'll have a mixed experience when working with them. Same as even just approaching different colleges, you're going to have a very different experience from college to college and in meeting with different disability services departments. Any questions so far? Okay. So I'll talk a little bit more about the difference between high school and college, because I think that that's really important to consider. So the big question is, who's in charge of making sure that your student gets accommodated once they go to college? It's in high school, it is the educator's responsibility that everyone has the IEP or 504 plan, and the parents are attending those meetings, excuse me. And it's a really collaborative effort between parents, educators, and the students to make sure that accommodations are facilitated in high school. But once you get to college, the student is primarily responsible for saying what they need and initiating the requests individually. So it can feel a little bit frustrating because you suddenly realize that no one is anticipating your needs. You have to be the one to anticipate them, or to report when you're experiencing an access issue as it occurs. And then it's the university's obligation to respond to that. So it's just a very different shift in who's responsible, who's looking out for you, and it really comes down to the student, and that can be a really difficult transition for all college students, suddenly having to figure out how they're going to get their laundry done, how they're going to manage their time. They get to pick their own class schedules, starting with, okay, how many classes a day can you really handle and still manage your disability? So these are all really good questions that every new college student is going to grapple with, and adding the additional layer of managing your disability is a complicated one. So that is a big thing to consider, that the role of primary advocate really changes when you go to college. So students with disabilities, if they want accommodations, must register with the Disability Services Office. You don't have to, but if you want accommodations or modifications, or if you know that you need facility access and maybe not all of the buildings have facility access, then you need to register with the office and make it known that you're going to need that. Yes?
So to make sure I understand, so basically there's no such thing as an IEP for a student in college?
So the question was, there's no such thing as an IEP for a student in college. That's true, there's no IEP. So instead of an IEP, the Disability Services Office issues letters to professors that tell them what the professors need to do in order to accommodate. And then in the background, the Disability Services Office is in charge of facilitating access to facilities or housing accommodations and other student life accommodations. But there's no IEP that contains everything. And that can be a big change too. So another thing that'll be sort of frustrating or strange is that you'll have to supply documentation to the university. And if you're using a wheelchair, it's evident that you have a disability, but your different universities will still require a doctor's letter that contains the diagnosis, a description of functional limitations, and what you need in a college environment. So that can be a little bit of another red tape to kind of just keep in mind that you'll need documentation. And an IEP or a 504 plan is not considered sufficient documentation, but what it is, though, is good proof of what you've had that worked previously. So, and every college is going to be really different. I also want to make sure that you know that, and identifying where the disability services office is in each university is going to be really key to figuring out how accessible is this university. Was it hard to find out where the disability services website was? If that's the case, then maybe it's not a great accessible university. You know, how inclusive is it? Just starting out with how do I contact someone for help is a great sort of flag of whether this is going to be an accessible experience or not. So yes, documentation is really different for college. You have to register with the office, you have to make your needs known, and then you also have to be ready to meet with your professors individually and let them know that you have accommodations. Sometimes you'll be able to just do this over email, and for the most part, professors just need to know what accommodations they need to implement in the classroom. So for example, if the accommodation issue is that you have to make sure that there's an accessible desk in the classroom, it's probably not the professor's job to do that, but it'll be the disability services job to get a facilities person to make sure that there's an accessible writing surface in the classroom. So you don't need to know that necessarily unless the disability services people are not doing what they should do. But when you have your initial meeting with disability services, you need to make sure that you sort of think about the whole process of what's it going to be like attending class, what do I need in the classroom, what are my academic adjustments, and what are my physical facilities requirements for attending class and participating. You don't have any obligation to disclose your diagnosis to anyone other than the Disability Services Office. In fact, your accommodation memos or letters that go from disability services to the professors, they will not disclose the nature of your disability. You're welcome to, though. In fact, I actually encourage students to identify themselves as having a disability and be part of what makes the fabric of diversity on a campus. But your personal information stays confidential with disability services, and you sort of also get to be in charge of disclosing as you want to. So for life on college campus, not only are you having to manage accommodations, making sure that people on campus are doing their jobs to make the appropriate accommodations for you, but you also need to think about your personal care needs throughout the day, if you have any. You need to think about housing and how you can live on campus if you want to live on campus. Are the dorms accessible to you? And you might have different accessibility needs than what the ADA dorms have. So if you can take a tour of the campus, that's really great. I actually would recommend that everyone take a tour of the campus that they're considering, because you never know when you're going to encounter a physical barrier that means that you can't get access to a building. As I'm sure any of you with wheelchair users in your family know, sometimes you show up and there's no ramp. And you need to know that if you're going to go to a campus that needs some work before they're ready for you. So then you also have to manage your time and manage your academics. Students with disabilities also have to do all of the coursework. So that can be really challenging. Thinking about managing your course load, tapping into tutoring services, academic support services, new student orientation activities. It's really overwhelming for everyone to start college. So knowing what resources are available to you and figuring out how to tap into those is just part of the process of learning how to live as a young college student, adult for the first time, being sort of on your own and being in charge of all these things. It's helpful to have a planner. but there's going to be social activities and clubs, and what if you're interested in the chess club but it meets in a location that you can't get to accessibly? Who do you call about that? So my best advice is to incoming college students is to think about what you're interested in, what you want to do, what you want out of the college experience, and then let the professionals who are in charge of disability and access services ensure that those things are accessible to you. That's the ideal, of course. But as we all know, sometimes you have to push when there's hesitation or a time delay. But you have the right to be accommodated. You have the right to have full access and inclusion. So knowing that there are reporting lines and grievance procedures is also really important. So my handout is actually a publication from the U.S. Department of Education that goes over what your rights are as a student with disabilities and also what your responsibilities are, but also includes contact information for if you're denied access or discriminated against, because that's never legal or okay. So then there's also an issue of getting involved as a student with a disability. Here at Stanford, we have a really active disabled students organization called Power to Act. It's a very cool group of students. They organize themselves. They're part of the, like I said, fabric of all of the really active student organizations. There's a lot of really great local youth and disability advocacy groups just here in the Bay Area that are not associated with schools too. It's very cool to be in college. It's a formative experience. It's when you start to get excited by things and involved with social justice and academics and innovation. And if you are someone who is into your disability as part of your identity, then that is really cool too. And knowing that there's opportunities to be organized and to be an activist for your own needs and for your collective needs, I really encourage that. I think it's very cool. So the sort of takeaways that I want you as families to know are that, one, universities and colleges are obligated to engage with you in what's called an interactive process. You outreach to the disability services and make your needs known. They need to respond to you and give you a plan for how they're going to accommodate you or make programming accessible that's not already accessible. It is really important that families work together. As you know, you've lived with your children their whole lives. You've helped them navigate all of these processes. How do you figure out how to let them go to college? I don't know. It's a very personal experience. It's a very daunting experience. It can feel really overwhelming, but it also feels really good at the same time. For some families, it's more cost effective to have a student live at home, especially if there are personal care needs that need to happen overnight, because what a college will not do is pay for personal care attendant services. So depending on what your student needs throughout the day, that the university is not responsible for accommodating. Anything that's considered a personal service or personal care need is not going to be provided by the university unless it's a specialized residential program. So, these are decisions that you have to figure out. How independent can the student live? Is a dorm doable? Does the student need overnight care? And if that's the case, the university should provide a dorm that's big enough to accommodate both a student overnight and a personal care attendant who will be providing care. So everything's just totally dependent on you and your families and what you can do and what you want to do. It's also good to know the resources and information. Who's paying for college? Who's paying for personal care attendance, books, supplies, mobility equipment? If you go to college and you need transportation, is the campus transportation accessible? Will you need to utilize paratransit? Figuring out what is available is really important, and also looking for experience has the university had students with muscular dystrophy before? What has worked for students in the past? These are really good questions. When you go to meet with disability services on college campuses, I would bring a list of questions of this nature. You know, what has worked for students in the past? What are some of the struggles that you've seen happening? And are these needs possible here? So doing your homework a little bit is going to go a long way as far as figuring out if the school and the disability services department is right for you. And then there's transition planning. So hopefully your schools have transition planning in place for the IEP process. I've seen a lot of IEPs that include sort of a final transition planning meeting, but it really, again, is dependent on what high school you're going to and whether you have a high school that is poorly resourced or richly resourced, and whether there is professionals nearby who can really walk you through the transition planning process. And if your school district isn't providing that more detailed guidance, then you can start to outreach to some of the community organizations. Like I mentioned, the independent living centers have advocacy professionals and community living professionals that can help you figuring out just how to put the logistics in place. The Department of Rehab, as I mentioned, also can provide some support. And also asking if you're looking at colleges outside of the Bay Area, I'm mostly familiar with what's here, but if you're thinking about going away to college, what is available there? What are some of the organizations that are there? What is working? And what could use improvement? Those are just some of the questions to consider. So questions, yes?
Can you talk a little bit about health insurance? I know that that's not specifically under your purview, but as part of the transition planning, some colleges require students to have proof of insurance, many have a student's version of insurance. What are the questions that people need to be asking, or how do they find out about whether they should stay on their family insurance or transition to a school-based one?
That's a really good question. So the question is, what should families consider regarding health insurance, and different schools having different requirements for health insurance? So most universities will have an undergraduate student health insurance plan. And in fact, most universities will also have a requirement for proof of health insurance if you decline the undergraduate plan before you can live in the dorms. If you're not living in the dorms, then I don't believe that there's a health insurance requirement generally. But if you have to consider, okay, should I put my undergraduate student on the school health plan, then you need to know whether the school health plan has the services that your student needs. If a lot of people with disabilities that I know, mostly adults, stay on Medi-Cal because Medi-Cal is more quick to pay for durable medical equipment than some private health insurances. So if you know that the health insurance plan that you have and that your student is continually eligible for until they're 26 is the best thing, then stick with that. But each health insurance group, I know here at Stanford we have what's called a continuum of care nurse who actually will walk students through looking at what their different health insurance options are to ensure that they make the best decision for them. But it's definitely something to continue to consider. Yeah. Great question. So is note-taking services and scribe accommodations or personal care? Those are reasonable accommodations. Note-taking services in particular usually are coordinated by the Disability Services Office, and at Stanford we hire a student in the class to share notes, and by share I mean at the end of class they scan the notes and send them digitally, or maybe provide a handwritten copy depending on the nature of the class. But note-taking services are an academic adjustment, or sometimes it's a copy of a professor's notes depending on the class and excuse me, the nature of the notes themselves. But that is a very common academic adjustment or accommodation, which is note-taking services, and scribing as well. sometimes the difference between personal service and accommodation can be fuzzy, and so that line can be a little bit fine sometimes. For example, it wouldn't be a reasonable accommodation to designate a student to get your books out of your backpack for you, but it would be a reasonable accommodation to have someone take notes for you. And why is that? I think it comes down to what the university can say that we can provide. If we hire someone to take notes for you, then we have created a contract where we're providing you notes. And if that note taker doesn't show up, then the professor needs to provide you a copy of notes. But if it's something along the nature of getting books out of a book bag and setting up your desk, that's a little bit more of a personal need. And as a student with a disability, it's probably good if you can figure out either if you need someone to help you get your books out of the bag, then either asking a nearby student or friend, hey, can you grab that for me? Or maybe the professor will do it for you. But that's an example of something that you would need to talk out a little bit with the Disability Services Department and see what they recommend.
So I hear that disability service is like some kind of thing, service per college, right?
Mm-hmm.
Does disability service help in, say, college planning, or like a high school student trying to get into college to evaluate like which college has what are the most services already looking for there? Do they help in that, or is it only after you join the college you can go to the disability service to exercise whatever rights you have?
So the question is, do disability services departments also help with planning and admissions,
Right.
really? So it really depends. For the most part, no. Disability services are only there to serve students once they're admitted, because once you're admitted, you're considered otherwise qualified to attend. But some public schools actually do have special admissions programs. Cal State East Bay has a special admissions program where they specifically work with students with disabilities into an admissions process for them. So some schools will have that specialized programming, but usually not. Yeah.
And does disability service provide evaluation of assistive technology and try to help in finding like which is best for the student?
Not all, but when you ask that question, and if the Disability Services has an assistive technology evaluation program, that's a great sign. So the bigger the school, the more students with disabilities will be there, the more robust the services will be. But at the same time, maybe you're a student who needs to be at a slightly smaller school. So it'll be a little bit of a balancing act between, does this Disability Services Department have all of the resources and expertise that I need, versus is this the right school environment for me? So at Stanford, we do have an assistive technology evaluation program, and Berkeley does as well, but a smaller private school in the Bay Area might not. And then that's when we would say, oh, have you worked with Department of Rehabilitation or the Center for Assistive Technology in Berkeley? So it's good to know too, if your disability services department that you're looking at doesn't have those things on site or doesn't have the expertise in technology that you might need, to know whether they have relationships with the nonprofit organizations who do those things. Yeah. And assistive technology is actually a really good thing to know about, because maybe instead of having textbooks to carry around with you, maybe you have all of your books put onto an iPad for you, and that's what you take to class. So knowing how to use alternative formats and assistive technology is going to be really helpful and make you able to keep up in your coursework efficiently.
Yeah, I'm curious. I'm aware of a lot of students who actually come out here to go to college from around the country, in part because of the weather, and it's easier to navigate. Is there much of an interaction between the different colleges, either at the student level or at the college level, for sharing ideas or increasing awareness about approaches to disabilities?
Well, I know as a professional in disability services in higher education that I'm a member of several professional organizations, And we have very active listservs because this happens a lot. Excuse me. An example is actually this issue of needing assistance getting textbooks out of your bag. So this is something that, why wouldn't the school provide someone to do that or designate someone to do that? Maybe just the answer is that we haven't done it before, or we require the student to be an advocate on that issue. But it actually comes up from time to time in our listservs. Is this something that we're doing? Are we creating a barrier by saying no to this request when it might actually be an achievable request? So I know professionally we are very connected in this field, because another thing that happens is that it's so totally subjective. When an individual student approaches me, tells me what they need, I make the decision based on that very subjective experience in the interactive process. So having that professional backup of, okay, what are the best practices happening right now? What is easily achievable? Where is that fine line? Is something that we constantly are looking at and moving, actually. So, but students being organized as a collective around the country of students with disabilities, I don't know if there is that, but like I said earlier, there are some really great local advocacy groups for youth. One is called Yo! Disabled and Proud, and they frequently will organize marches to Sacramento and, and organize and publish things, and that's very cool. There are leadership conferences that happen where students with disabilities from all over the country will gather in Sacramento or in New York and attend leadership conferences to be part of the emerging group of leaders with disabilities, because that is so integral to the college experience too, is finding your voice and finding what you want to do and going for it. One thing that Stanford does that's very cool is annually we have a relationship with an organization called Lime Connect, which is an emerging leaders training institute for college students with disabilities. So juniors and seniors apply for an internship, and you go and you spend the summer in New York City, and you work for Google or tech or policy development or whatever your expertise is, but it's a very cool scholarship system. On my handout on the last page are several links, and one of those advocacy organizations on there keeps a list of scholarships. As you know, it is very expensive to sustain living with a disability with full inclusion and attend college and live in the Bay Area. So applying for every scholarship, getting every financial resource available is going to be really important, and a lot of work as well.
So so you said scholarship, right? Does disability service provide, like, say, placement or like finding internships or like jobs after your graduation? Because their requirements might be different from, let's say, typical college placement services.
Right. So the question is there college placement and career placement services? Yes. It depends. So at Stanford, we don't do that, but we have a fully